Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. To borrow an observation from my friend Polyphonic, there's lots of bands who could claim to have invented metal, but there's no one who could claim to have done it after Black Sabbath. The ideas were out there in various forms, but Sabbath crystallized them into a unique, instantly recognizable genre, making them the first undeniable heavy metal band, and since metal was how I got into music in the first place, I figured it was time to pay tribute by looking at one of my favorite Sabbath songs, Iron Man. Let's take it apart. The song starts with Bill Ward playing slow quarter notes on the kick drum like footsteps from an approaching monster, and then suddenly Tony Iommi comes screaming in with these powerful bends, like the wordless screams of their metallic man. These two parts, combined with a robotic voice proclaiming itself Iron Man, immediately put you in the middle of a monster movie like you're hiding under a table as Iron Man approaches. It's a really nice piece of sound painting, using musical elements not for their tonal functions, but for the imagery they create. From there, we move into the song proper, beginning with the iconic riff, and I'm gonna do something a little unusual. I'm gonna analyze this in two different keys. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm pretty sure the song is best understood in the key of E minor, but there's some parts that make more sense if you're willing to think of it in B minor too. It's kinda like a ghost key, a faint echo of tonality sitting behind the main key and providing additional elements. Like, take this trill. Now sure, both these notes are in E minor, but metal, especially early metal, draws heavily from the blues, so I wouldn't actually expect to see the E minor scale. You're much more likely to see minor pentatonic, which is where you take minor and remove the two least important notes to create a more streamlined scale that's less internally dissonant, and here's the thing. F sharp and G, the two notes in this trill, are also the only difference between E minor pentatonic and B minor pentatonic, so we can kind of view the trill as representing two different notes in our two different keys. In the main key, E minor, it's a G and the riff sounds like this. We're basically just outlining an E minor 7 chord. If we ignore the first half of each bar though, we notice that they both end the same way, with D resolving to E. This repeated resolution is one of the main reasons I think the E analysis is stronger. It's really hard to not hear this as flat 7 going to 1, and approaching it from below in the first bar and above in the second makes it even harder. The shape of the riff is effectively orbiting around this central resolution, but it is a little weird that we're not starting on the root. In fact, if we look ahead, we see most of the riffs in this song actually start on B, not E, so let's at least consider the possibility we're in that key. Here, that trill becomes an F sharp, and we instead see the development of a chord progression from 1 to 4 to 5 and back to 4. This sort of motion is common in early rock and other blues-based traditions, where instead of pointing back to 1, the 5 chord just melts down to 4, which then resolves back home. The D resolutions do kinda interfere with this, since they're not really a part of that implied progression, so again, I don't think we're actually in B, it's just sort of lending its F sharp to us for flavor, because if we just play Gs here, the whole thing sounds kinda flat. This section is also doing something cool with textures. Not only is Iommi playing the riff, but Geezer Butler is doubling it on the bass, and once Ozzy Osbourne comes in, he sings it too. Every melodic part is playing the exact same line in unison, creating a texture called monophony, or one sound. This sort of collective monophony, where multiple voices perform the same line, is common in religious chants, and using it here gives the story of Iron Man a sort of mythic quality, a singular musical focus that draws you in from all sides. From there, we move to the interlude, where we get a new riff, and this is where I think the ghost key analysis starts to really pay off. We seem to be outlining a pair of chords, first B minor, then some sort of A chord. In E, these would be 5 and 4, and again, that's a pretty common blues thing. If you're familiar with the 12-bar blues pattern, these are bars 9 and 10, and we're just looping them a couple times, but that feels a bit off to me, because in the 12-bar blues, bar 9 feels like an event. There's a big jump up to the 5 chord, suddenly throwing you somewhere completely different, but in Iron Man, that's just not what this feels like to me. It feels very smooth, and I think that's best best explained by the idea that we were already kind of in B the whole time. In that key, this section starts on the 1 chord, which is why it's so stable, and then it goes to flat 7. As we mentioned before, flat 7 to 1 is a pretty common resolution in blues-influenced music too, so this section can easily be read as a vamp on those 2 chords. If we take a broader view, I'd still say this is 5, 4, and E minor, but the ghost key's gotten a bit stronger here. But enough about keys, what's going on with this G sharp? That's not an E minor or B minor. No, this is what's called an approach note. We're trying to get back to A, so we're just stepping into it from below, and the cool thing about approach notes is that they don't really have to be in the key. I mean, they can be, we could have used G natural here. But half-step motion is generally stronger than whole-step motion, so using G-sharp instead makes it feel more powerful. This is especially important because the G-sharp falls on beat 3, one of the most prominent parts of the bar, and if you're gonna do something weird in such an important position, the best way to sell it is to really commit. And that half-step motion continues upwards, ending the bar on B-flat. In fact, both bars end on B-flat. As we'll mention in a bit, B-flat is kind of in E minor, so we can read it as belonging to that key, but really I think it's just a passing note. We're trying to move from B to A and back again, and the only standard note that fits there is B-flat. Just like the G-sharp, it's there to smooth out the transition, and since it's on a much weaker beat, it kinda just melts into the background of the riff. And I want to quickly mention the rhythm in the first bar. Iommi hits the downbeat and then switches to upbeats for the rest of it. This gives it a bouncy, syncopated feel in contrast to the plodding, almost metronomic main riff. The second bar goes back to emphasizing the beats, but remember this rhythm, it'll come up again later. This is also where our monophony starts to break down. Butler plays the first half along with Iommi, but under the A chord, his line is different. It's really quiet in the original track, so it doesn't have a huge impact on the listening experience, although you can definitely feel that the bass has at least stopped playing in the lower register, which gives the line some extra lift even if you can't tell exactly what it is doing. That's probably for the best, because the line actually clashes pretty hard with Iommi's part in a couple spots. The first A-G trill is played underneath the G-sharp, so you get 2 different kinds of half-step rub, and then he falls down to E just as Iommi goes to B-flat, making a tritone. If these parts were both equally loud, they'd sound really dissonant together, but because Butler's is so much quieter, you can hear the guitar as the lead and the bass as a set of decorations underneath. It all works because the mix tells you how to treat each part. Although honestly, if the bass just laid out here instead, I'm not sure it would have made much difference. Still though, fun little Easter egg. Before we move on though, I want to talk about another part that's doing a whole lot more here, the drums. At the same time Butler jumps up for that high part, Ward lays down a huge drum fill that really brings the section to life. It's easy to forget the drums because they're not playing notes or chords, but in metal especially, it's hard to overstate the importance of a good drummer, and this section shows why. Again, the verse has this slow, plodding quality to it, and the interlude largely does too, but thanks to Ward's drum fills, it takes on a whole new sort of energy. And the homophony continues to break down once we get to the chorus. Here, Iommi holds chords while Butler takes over the riffing, walking up and down the various chord scales to provide some motion while Iommi takes a bit of a break. Here we see that same 1 flat 7 vamp, but this time in our main key, we've taken our ghost progression and brought it home. We also get a bit more information on the implied chord qualities. Iommi's playing power chords, so he's no help, but over the E chord, Ozzy sings a G and Butler plays a D, so altogether this is E minor 7, and then for the D chord, they both play F sharps and Butler adds a C sharp too, so it's D major 7. That's a bit strange. In E minor, the D chord is supposed to be dominant with a C natural. I mean, I suppose we could be in E Dorian, a scale that's like minor but with a raised 6th, making it less dark and more happy, but that doesn't sound like an accurate description of Iron Man. No, I think this is best viewed as a callback to that G sharp in the interlude. We're borrowing the chord progression from our ghost key there, so why not borrow the approach note too? In the second half of the chorus, our progression gets interrupted by a new riff, and I've got a bit of a confession to make. I said that in this sort of blues-influenced music we'd expect to see the minor pentatonic scale, but that's not actually true. What we'd really expect to see is the blues scale, which is like minor pentatonic, but you add an extra note in between the 4th and the 5th, giving you this cool little run of half steps inside your otherwise open scale. With that in mind, let's go back to the riff. We start with a couple B power chords to define the harmony, then we have these little 16th note walk-ups. The first one is B, D, and E, which you might recognize as the first 3 notes of our main riff, just played a whole lot faster, like a little motif to help tie the sections together. From there, we see the real reason I wanted to do this whole ghost key thing in the first place. Iommi plays the half-step clusters from both B blues and E blues, back to back. If this whole thing is in E, then we'd probably have to just call this F a random passing note, but given the structural significance of this cluster in the B blues scale, I think that's a much weaker analysis, especially because this line starts by making sure you know that the implied harmony here is a B chord. This riff is effectively the synthesis of our two keys, clearly cementing us not in either one, but in both at the same time. And that has interesting implications for the harmony too. We said the first two chords were 1 and flat 7, which they are, but they're also kind of 4 and flat 3. They have this downward momentum that lands on the B chord, but then that B chord turns around and points us back towards E. Listening to this section, I can easily convince myself to hear either chord as the point of resolution. After the second chorus though, everything changes. Here we've shifted to a whole new key, C# minor. It's honestly a little surprising how smooth this transition is. C# minor isn't all that similar to either of our previous keys, so you'd expect at least a bit of a jolt, but they cover it up really well with the shape of the line. The riff beforehand was walking up to B, and this one starts on C#, the next note up in that scale, then walks back down. It feels like a direct melodic answer to the previous riff, and since the notes B and C# both exist in both keys, they can serve as a bit of a pivot so that by the time we start resolving to C# instead, it doesn't feel that surprising. And that resolution may sound familiar. It's the same flat 7-1 motion we saw in the main riff. In fact, it's even the same rhythm, just played twice as fast. Once again, motifs. Beyond that, the riff is basically just a walk down the blues scale, but it still feels super powerful because of the rhythm. They're playing these sharp staccato stabs on all the upbeats, just like we saw in the interlude riff, but using 16th note syncopation instead of 8th notes, and the whole thing's done in stop time where everyone is hitting those same attacks and nothing else. Combining syncopation, staccato, and stop time turns each individual note into its own musical event, so you really feel the pull of this descent. From there, we launch into the solo, which is in double time. This sudden jump in tempo combined with a key change makes the solo feel almost like an action sequence to me. The song has introduced us to the monstrous Iron Man through the verses and choruses, and now he's finally ready to attack. It's a very cinematic approach to songwriting. Note-wise, the solo seems to stick almost exclusively to the C# minor pentatonic scale, and since all the notes in that scale sound good together, this means he can do basically whatever he wants and it'll work. It also gives Butler the freedom to play around. He's mostly playing C# in various octaves, but he also throws in some runs like this. And while they may have coordinated this beforehand, they kinda didn't have to, because whatever notes Iommi was playing over it, as long as they mostly stuck to minor pentatonic, nothing was gonna clash. It almost feels like they're both soloing at the same time, and they're able to get away with it thanks to the power of pentatonics. After that solo, we get that C# walkdown again, then the chorus riff, then back for one final verse. After our whirlwind tour of all the riffs we've heard so far in the song, everyone drops out while Ward switches back to double time and starts building up energy again. Butler joins him, playing E really fast, and then finally Iommi comes back with those wordless guitar screams from the intro. Back then, these were playing over a slow, plodding kick, but this time they're over some of the busiest rhythms we've heard all song. It's incredibly frantic, conjuring up an image of all the people running away from Iron Man now that his rampage has truly begun. After a while, Butler starts playing roots to a chord progression while Iommi gives us one final solo, although interestingly, the two don't seem to have much to do with each other. Iommi's sticking pretty strictly to E minor pentatonic, whereas Butler's doing this descending half-step line that goes outside the scale. The two even directly clash sometimes, like when Iommi plays a D over Butler's C#. But because the pentatonic scale is such a strong sound, and because we've already heard Butler's loop a couple times at this point, we can independently accept each component even though on paper you might not expect it to work nearly as well as it does. And that's pretty much it. I think this song is a great example of how much storytelling you can do with musical structure. It honestly plays almost like a movie with clear narrative beats driven by their compositional choices. Plus, it's got some amazing riffs, all built from pretty simple components but perfectly crafted to make it feel epic from start to finish. Songs like Iron Man helps define a new path for increasingly heavy music that eventually led to some of my favorite artists of all time, and 50 years later, it still rocks just as hard as the day it was released. Anyway, thanks for watching. As always, this song was chosen by my patrons on Patreon. The poll to pick the next one goes up over there next week. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.